Today we're going to talk about lesson 3, and let's see, what we'll start talking about is Great Britain. So Britain, if you recall back, the Anglo-Saxons had a kingdom there, and there was, remember, this is the time when there are not big empires and there are more individual kingdoms, right? So the Anglo-Saxons are there. They've been having a lot of trouble with outside invasions, and so there's a king, King Alfred, who is able to get all the Anglo-Saxons to unite and work together to keep the Vikings from taking over. And so it's around that time that this is where it was starting to be called Angleland, right, from Anglo-Saxon, or of course then now England. So let's see, some time goes on. And then eventually in 1066, there is a problem where one of the kings died and there's not a clear heir to take over. And so there's a big controversy between two people who are claiming that they should be the next ruler. One of them was a noble, and his name was Harold Godwinson. And then the other person who was challenging him for the throne was someone who is related through blood, William the Duke of Normandy, but remember Normandy is over in France, right? And so he is of the blood, but he is like a foreigner, right? And he claims he's the rightful king. So William comes over with his army and he invades and he tries to take over by force. The Normans are knights, they have cavalry. Harold has foot soldiers. It's the very famous battle called the Battle of Hastings. And long story short, William wins. He's now the King of England, and he's named William the Conqueror because of it. So, of course, though, the people are not feeling William too much, right? He's an outsider. And so they resist him. And William's not having it, so he says, fine, if you Anglo-Saxon nobles are going to resist, then I'll just take the land, and I'm the king, so I'll give it to my people. And so he gives it to his knights that helped him win it, okay? And he wants to know what he has, right, in this new land, so he does a very, very complete census, right? Census is a count of the population, and actually he went much further. He actually had them record all the animals and things too. So he's trying to figure out what exactly people have so he knows how much to tax them. Okay, and this very complete record is called the Domesday Book. I know that's a weird name. It comes from because the record keeping was so complete and specific that it felt like the same as in Judgment Day when supposedly, right, if you your list of all your sins and everything are reported when you're judged, when you go to heaven, right? So that's why they're saying it felt like that, right? That it was so that the decision of how much you're taxed is based on this specific evidence, and it really had an impact. Anyway, so the Normans take over. They keep some things, right? The laws stay the same, things like that. But they do bring a lot of their own customs too. Of course, he's going to put his own people in power, and they are from France, right? So, or actually it's called Normandy at that point. So, but they speak French. You're going to see a lot of building in the French style, and a lot of their skills are going to come and be taught, so they're going to translate and come over to England. So there's a lot of new ideas too. Okay, now remember, like a lot of the people that live there though are Anglo-Saxons, so their language is going to continue, which nowadays, like later, it's called English, right? And eventually over time, as people intermarry, there's going to kind of become a new culture that is a mix of these ideas. All right, so let's see. We eventually get to King Henry II. He is one of the ones that goes and expands the power of England. He gets more land, Wales, Ireland. He also has some control over areas in France and Scotland. A lot of that was because he married Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Do you remember we talked about how marriage is not for love, right? It's for what you can get, and power and things like that, and wealth of lands. Henry was someone who made a decision that they needed to have consistent law being set up. So he had courts and lawyers and judges set up, and they would travel across. They're called circuit judges. They would travel around the country and hear cases, and make sure that things were decided the way that the same across the whole of England. So that was a new idea, kind of having what they call common law, right? It's all the same throughout the kingdom, and that's going to help unite England. The other thing is he set up juries of your peers, right, citizens, and then they also added another thing is a grand jury. Okay, and we have these even today, right? A grand jury is there's a group of people who decide, they hear the preliminary evidence and they decide, should they go forward with the case? Like, do they have enough to actually try you on this crime? So that's even true today. Like if you're accused of murder, right, you go to a grand jury first and they say, yes, we think there's enough that we should have a trial. We think that you might be guilty, and then they actually go to the real trial. And then so there's a second jury, right, the real trial jury, where they actually decide if you are in fact innocent or guilty, and it's a full trial. Okay, so Henry's son is actually the one who becomes kind of infamous, I guess. His name is John, King John, and you hear about him in like Robin Hood and everything, right? He was kind of a scoundrel. He increased the taxes a ton. He was known for punishing people without fair trials, and the nobles did not care for him, right? They did not like his method of ruling. They did not think it was okay that he was doing all this. So they basically banded together and said, if you need to sign this. It's called the Magna Carta. And I know you've heard of the Magna Carta before, right? Which basically puts some limits on the king. The king can't do anything he wants. And we're not going to support you, right? They threatened if you don't put some limits in. Okay, and so he's basically kind of forced him to add these rights in that, like, you have to have a fair trial by a jury. You can't just, punish people willy-nilly. That's not okay. So all these like limits to the king's power, and that is really, really important because the Magna Carta, of course, becomes a major document not only in England, but of course in like every major government after, and ours, right? Very, very, you can see a lot of similarities that we modeled ours after, right? And the reason why they thought that should be is that kind of that feudal idea that the king, right, we're loyal to you because you're taking care of us, and you basically that you need to do it but too, right? It works both ways. Okay. Then we're going to quickly talk about how other major improvements, like Edward the First, a little bit later, he decides there's going to be a group of people, a mixed group, right? Lords, church leaders, knights, all regular people, and they're going to be what are known as Parliament. Now, we know today that Parliament is the lawmaking body in England, and it has two different groups, the upper house and the lower house, and that is still true today. So this is the very beginning idea of that Parliament, and the idea that the people should have a more direct say in the government. Okay, now we're going to switch over and talk about France. So that was all England. Again, go backwards, right, in your mind, in your time machine. Remember when Charlemagne was king, right? And it got split up. Okay, so we're going to talk about France, right? So in the western part, in what's France, there is a king Remember, the Frankish groups were in control. Hugh Capet was the one who's going to make these dynasty of French kings. Okay, they call it the Capetian dynasty after Capet. But it was very small at first. It was only around what the city of Paris, basically, very small. But they had the power, these nobles, and then after some time, Philip II becomes king of France, and he is trying to change things. He fights a lot of wars. He gets more land. He tries to get more wealth and power and everything during his time. Then Philip IV raised a lot of taxes because he wanted to also go fight a lot of wars and get a lot of land. One of the things he's famous for is having kind of what we call like different, they call them estates. They're kind of like class system, okay? So there was the high one. The first estate was the clergy or the priests, which is normally the case, right? Then right under that would be nobles, the second estate, and then under them, of course, are like the regular people, the townspeople and the peasants, okay, and the third estate. So the reason I'm even mentioning that is because of that, we get the name for France's first parliament, the States General. That's the English version, right? French would be like État Général, right? Anyway, so it is also an idea of having like a representative government. It wasn't quite as big as the Parliament in England, but it is that kind of same idea. So we see the idea of spreading of representative government. Okay. Now we're going to switch over and talk about the Slavs, which is interesting because most Americans don't talk about this region that much. So this might seem less familiar to you. Really quickly, we're going to go through quite a bit of history and just really of overview. The Slavs, we've talked about them slightly, right? Remember, in this region, there weren't empires, right? There's these, what they call medieval states, right? Smaller kingdoms. So it's the same over here in this group. And there's basically like three major ones. The Kievan Rus is an area, like a state or a kingdom. And they, of course, are going to do well financially because of trading with Scandinavia. You can see on the map. This one doesn't show. I'll add one. With Scandinavia and the Byzantines, the Byzantine Empire. They do well with trade with them, okay? Their ruler, the first king, is Vladimir, and he marries the sister of the Byzantine emperor. And remember, right, he does that for power and good relations and money and things like that. So, of course, though, remember, the Byzantines are Eastern Orthodox Christians, right? And so he, of course, has to convert and become Eastern Orthodox, and that is how we get the Eastern Orthodox religion to spread into, the Slavic and, of course, eventually Russian area, okay? So that is why, because of the marriage, and then, of course, they start spreading Eastern Orthodox religion in that area, okay? And then everything that goes along with it. So you see like a lot of the architecture and the art and stuff reflecting that too. Okay, now the Mongols. Where's John Green? He'd want to do a Mongoltage, right? They come in and conquer this area. One of the cities that escapes it is Novgorod, and that was only because they agreed to pay them a lot of money and, tribute. We've talked about that, right? And the Mongol leader accepted it and let them, so he didn't put up a fight, and the Mongols said, fine, if you just keep paying us, we won't ruin your city, okay? But of course that doesn't make everything perfect for them. They have all these other problems with the other groups, the Germans and the Swedes. And so there's a prince who comes in control, Alexander Nevsky, and he is able to defeat those other invaders. And what we need to talk about then going on is a lot of them start moving north, okay? And that's what we now know as Russia. The settlement at the time was called Moscow. No surprise, right? The city is named after. And this was a large city, and again, became very rich because of trade, okay, on a crossroads. They actually cooperate with the Mongols and get along with them, and so well, in fact, that the Mongols let them kind of tax and control the other territories of Slavs. And if the Slavs couldn't pay the tax or gave enough soldiers, then the Moscow rulers would just say, fine, then we're taking over. And that's how they were able to expand their territory. If you look at the map, you can see how it was very small at first, that pink, and then they grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the biggest rulers who made a big difference in this was Ivan III. Ivan III, again, marries into the niece. Sophia was a niece of the emperor, the Byzantine emperor. And he, of course, is going to do the same thing. He gets a lot of power for himself, and he is the one who starts wanting to be referred to as Tsar, which means emperor in Russian. And he is quite the lavish and wants to build this huge empire. He even drives out the Mongols eventually and adds a lot more territory. So he has a lot of, on that map up there, he did a lot of that, right? Getting more and more land for his. And so now we would call this time now an empire again. It's a Russian empire, which is not something we learn too much about in American history. Okay, and then this is the whole point of this. We're going to go back to Europe again, and we're going to talk about what happens. So in the Byzantine Empire, remember that the Muslim Turks came in and took over, right? And when they did that, the Byzantine emperor asked Pope Urban II for help. Okay, this is not the same story as we were talking about before. Remember that old story we were talking about? It was the Roman Pope who asked the Byzantines for help. Well, this time it's the opposite. The Byzantine emperor asks the Pope over in Rome for help. Now, he wants help to save them from the Muslims, right? The Turks are Muslim. He says, like, we're both Christian. We should band together, and we should not let these Muslim infidels, they call them, right, ruin our Christianity, our empire, and we should work together. So that works, and Pope Urban isn't stupid. He says, if I help them and we put it back together again, right, maybe the churches will be together, the Roman Catholic Church that he is, and then the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Byzantine world, right, and he can put them back together, and then of course he'll be the one who did that, and I'll be the leader of everything, and that's a big power play, right? So what he does to get the help that he needs for this holy war, he goes to all the nobles and he basically says, this is your religious duty. The Muslims are coming in and conquering our brethren, and it is our duty to save them and to save the Holy Land. So, right, how all the religions basically start in around Jerusalem, right? Well, he says the Muslims have it, and we have to save our Holy Land where Jesus lived, right? And all that. We have to save it from these terrible, infidels, they call them, Muslims. And so he makes it a holy war, and so people feel like it's their religious duty to go fight, okay? And so a lot of these nobles do this, and you can, it's called the Crusades, and you can see over here on the other right-hand page that everyone's wearing a white tunic with a red cross. That is the symbol of them. They're fighting for Christianity, right? The cross. So you will see that in a lot of art and movies and things. And so I'm going to do this really quickly because it's 200 years of fighting. So the first crusade, they go to Jerusalem, they fight with the Muslims. They do pretty well in the first one. They do push them out of Jerusalem. They get some other lands in Asia Minor and what we now would call Lebanon. And that's great. Although picture that, right? Or look in the map. they're surrounded otherwise by Muslim territory. So that's great that they got those few areas, but they're still basically surrounded. So it was hard. They had to try to get all their supplies and everything from like Italy, right? And so that would be difficult to do. So the Second Crusade starts because the Muslims are not going to stand for that, and they want to retake their land. So they do. And in the second one, I would say basically the short story is the Muslims easily beat the Europeans and pushed them out. A lot of that was due to Saladin, who's a famous general. And then the Third Crusade is basically, again, the Europeans couldn't beat them. And the long story short is basically in the end, the Muslims have gained back all the land that the Crusaders had taken from them originally. And so all that fighting was for nothing. Okay. So let's talk about the effects then. So like any time that you go into new lands, there are going to be some like exchange of ideas. You get a spreading of different ways to build architecture and different art and mosaics and things. Better shipbuilding, how to make better maps, compass directions, right? All these things that they need to be able to do well to go on in this war. And then also they're exposed to other goods from these areas, right? So the people, they bring back, right, some things like lemons or silk or, right, things that are not as widely available in Europe. And so then they get a taste for it and people want more, like trading with these places, okay? It was bad in the sense that feudalism got weakened by a lot. A lot of the nobles to go on this crusade, this holy war, they sold all their land because going to war is also expensive. And so they, of course, freed their serfs, right? Because there's no one, they don't own the land anymore and the people aren't going to work for them. So when they come back even, or when, in the meantime, kings are the main person left to have control, right? We don't have all these nobles having a lot of control regionally. And so that is a shift in like government, okay? They can build more stronger central governments instead of these like smaller, different, feudal systems. The other thing is, of course, probably the biggest takeaway is, Muslims and Christians are going to have very sore feelings at each other. They fought this war. A lot of people were killed. They, said each other were terrible. And so for the rest of history, right, there's a lot of bitter feelings now between Christians and Muslims.